So can I hand you over to Giles to talk about wind farms in Dorset? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Can everyone hear me? Give me a wave if you can hear me. Excellent. Let me just share my screen. I'll just put that onto full screen if I can. Right, can you all see that? Yep. Good. Okay. I mean, first of all, from me, thank you very much indeed for coming. It was my foolish idea to have this event a few years back. So the old principle, if you step forward, you're going to get done first of all. But I think
sorry, Giles, to interrupt you. Sorry, could everybody else mute, because there's a lot of interference on the line at the moment.
That's a very good idea. Sam, you can actually mute everybody else yourself as the host of this project, or ask Tracy to do that, just to check. Just a few words of introduction. Onshore wind is quite a controversial project, quite a controversial subject, particularly in Dorset.
It's Gordon Ledbetter that's got his mic on unmute.
Right. Sam, am I okay to go ahead? Because I can't see everybody on the screen. Yeah, okay, I'll continue. So I just want to say as upfront is that it's quite a controversial project, quite a controversial concept. And, you know, lots of people have very differing views on offshore wind. I notice on this call, there are a number of people who are supporters. There are also a number of people who are dead against onshore wind. And I think we just need to be very aware that people have every right to have different attitudes to a subject like this. And so just need to be respectful of that. I mean, what I'm going to try and do is make the case for onshore wind, but I do recognize that it is not everybody's cup of tea. So I'm going to present what I hope will be seen as some factual information. But as always, there is some interpretation that takes place. So I'm going to give
recording
a little bit of context.
in progress.
I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody. Sam, are you able to?
Yeah. Can whoever is got a mute someone? Can they please mute Gordon?
Sam, are you able to mute everybody else, if that's possible? Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of context. I'm going to say why onshore wind is important, in my opinion. I'm going to talk about a few local opportunities and issues, and then finish off with sort of where to from now. So I'll start off with quite a busy slide, but I think it's really quite an important concept, this one, because this is really the context for where we are now with renewable energy versus conventional hydrocarbon energies. So the curve to look at are the orange and green curves, which come to the very bottom right of the graph in 2020. These are the curves for wind and solar panels, and it shows a huge decrease in the unit cost for these energy sources over the last 10-year period. I mean, really exceptional change in the unit price for those renewable energies. And that really is what's driving a lot of this, because we want our energy to be cheap, we want it to be available, we want it to be low carbon as well. And wind and solar are the two mainstays of that. They have become very accessible, the technology has become mature, and the costs have been driven down to levels which would have been inconceivable even a few years ago. And it's really completely changed the scene. I mean, even in the last few years, we've gone from a state whereby natural gas generators were seen as the lowest cost, and they would be seen as supporting renewable energies. And that has all changed in the last 5 years. Now wind and solar are clearly the better option. It also shows some of the other energies. I mean, I'm personally dead against nuclear power. And one of the concepts against that is that it is extremely expensive. I mean, there are other reasons why you might not like it, but at a cost of something like 8 times the cost of solar and wind, it's really unaffordably expensive and also takes a very long time to get projects off the ground. In practice, I mean, you would probably want to say goodbye to all those top 4 on the graph. You want to get rid of nuclear, of course. You want to get rid of coal. You'd like to be able to get rid of gas, though it's actually quite a good transitional fuel in other parts of the world. And you'd certainly like to get rid of what's called the gas peaker, which is what happens when you need an extra bit of energy at peak times, and then they have to throw the switch on a whole separate power station and expensively provide that so you can boil your kettles. So balancing the systems is extremely important.
Giles, can I just quickly ask a clarification question?
Sure.
Is the graph for onshore or offshore wind?
I haven't separated. Those two are actually combined together. If you look at the words at the bottom there, that's the most up-to-date information I've been able to find. And you can see that this was taken from an American site for global average levelized cost of electricity. And it shows that the cheapest of all is onshore wind, and offshore wind is about twice as expensive as onshore wind. And that's a fairly reasonable guide. When you've got offshore wind, you've got a lot more maintenance costs. You've got the cost of bringing the electricity onshore. So those additional costs have to be taken into account. In terms of UK consumption of energy, this is not just electricity. This is using cars. This is fuel in commercial industries, etc. Then you can see that renewables are still quite a small proportion of our total energy bill. We still use a lot of gas and oil and a tiny amount of coal now. Nuclear is in the mix, but bioenergy and hydro, wind and solar are increasing. If you go back to electricity, then you can see that, you know, the big story really is the fact that coal has been all but phased out over the last 10 years, which is an astonishing achievement to have done that. Only a tiny amount now is really there for energy security, and that the renewables are increasing at a very quick rate. And it's not uncommon to find days when we have more renewables than any other source. If you look at the electricity generated just in 2022, that's an average for the year, and that's fairly typical. You can see gas is up there at the highest, around just under 40%, but wind is the second biggest source of energy for our electricity supply at about a quarter. Interestingly, you can go on the, that should say National Grid Live website. I did this at 7:10 this evening, and you can see the breakdown at that time. It's the circular graph on the left-hand side, and you can see that we were still using about 7.1% of solar. Wind was at 17%, which is disappointingly low, but the wind is not strong today. And gas was at about 50%. So it's actually very nice. You can track this in real time and see where we are. Now, the history of wind and solar, the two main renewable energies, is one which is quite interesting in the UK. You can see these three graphs for solar, offshore and onshore wind. So currently we still have more onshore wind than offshore wind, and that's mainly due to Scotland and to a certain extent Wales. England is quite a long way behind. But offshore wind is due to increase a lot. But what you see on onshore wind is that there was a very steep increase between about 2013 and 2015, and then it flattened off very quickly. And there was, at the time of the Cameron Conservative government, there was a lot of concern about the increase of onshore wind in England. And they made some changes which have had a profound effect on our ability to get onshore wind projects approved. So there were two particular things which happened. Firstly, they were excluded from the CFD, which is the contract for difference rounds. That's the government mechanism they use for contracting renewable energy. And that meant that companies that were trying to do onshore wind were being excluded from the finances that they needed to be able to raise the money to do that. And the second thing they did was to change the planning restrictions. And there is a famous footnote 54 to the NPPF, which I'm very briefly going to put up in front of you, which had a profound effect. Two particular things. It said that you had to have your wind development identified in a development or neighbourhood plan. And secondly, that the planning impacts that affected the community had to be fully addressed and have their proposal, and the proposal have their backing. And that has become interpreted by some people that a very small minority of people can block any onshore wind project. And the impact of those things together has been that there have been very, very few projects approved. And if you look at the statistics, since 2018, there's been 1.2 gigawatts approved in Scotland, 230 megawatts in Wales, and only 50 megawatts in England. And this is just, it says less than 0.1% of the capacity is currently under construction. So at the moment, we are basically hardly approving any onshore wind projects at all. Of course, the bigger picture is that offshore wind is really what most people are banking on as being the salvation of humanity, if I put it that way. We're expecting seeing a very large growth in offshore wind worldwide, and Britain is no exception. I mean, we have been leading in offshore wind over the last 10 years, but we will be overtaken and have already been overtaken by China, of course. But we are expecting a massive increase. If you look at the wind power generation in the UK, you can see that with the proliferation of projects in Scotland and Wales, and to a certain extent on the north coast of Cornwall, which has been quite popular, and some around the eastern side. But there's a dearth of projects in the south and almost none at all in Dorset. I've just got the arrow there to the Hornsea wind farm, offshore wind farm, which is currently the largest wind farm in the world, 4 phases, of which 2 are currently producing. And then if you go European-wide, there's a huge number of projects, offshore wind projects, which are planned to take place offshore. And if you look at the North Sea, historically, it's been the powerhouse of Europe because of its hydrocarbons. It's extremely likely that over the next 50 years, it will become the powerhouse of Europe for its renewable energy. And there are big plans. The North Sea itself could provide enough energy for the whole of Europe 10 times over. And with the advent of floating wind farms, that is probably what's going to come about. And we will see over the next decades wind farms and associated hydrogen infrastructure. So wind power that's not being used immediately will probably be converted through electrolysis into electricity and then shipped abroad, into hydrogen. And the hydrogen will be used in hydrogen-powered generators. So onshore wind, let me summarize the advantages. I mean, what I've just been discussing is the fact it is currently the lowest cost renewable energy source, which immediately makes it very attractive. It's also very complementary with solar, and I'm going to come on to talk a little bit about that. The speed the capacity can be delivered is also important. You know, if we're going to be concerned about net zero, it's not just delivering it in 30 years' time, it's actually delivering it now in the short term so that we can reduce our carbon footprint. It has a relatively low impact on agriculture. Wind farms have a small footprint. You can still run your crops and your livestock or your cereals around a wind farm, unlike solar, which is much more disruptive. It's close to users, so a low impact on the grid. You don't have to bring it from offshore through major power lines. Oh, sorry, wrong one. And it affords the opportunity, I believe, for local decarbonisation, so taking control of our own decarbonisation agenda. So if we just say something about solar now, in fact, because this is about how complementary it is with wind. Because a lot of people say, well, look, why don't we just go out and put solar on rooftops? Why do we go out and just do solar and not bother with onshore wind? And the problem is that it has particular characteristics. So during the day, of course, you're generating during daylight hours, but you're not generating at night time. And it's a steep curve on either side. So this is particularly good for some types of usage, like offices and schools, where they need the energy during the day, solar power is brilliant. Other groups, in fact, such as domestic users who have their peak often in early evening and wintertime, it's really not so convenient. If you look at the average over the year, you can also see the very distinct shape. So between, for 6 months, quite a generous amount in the middle of the year, from late spring to early autumn, you see pretty strong generation from solar power. But during the winter time, which is often where we need that power for heating our houses or running our heat pumps, it is much, much lower and therefore is less effective. Now, it will be no surprise to you to show this graph. This just happened to be one I picked off the internet and comes from America, but wind generally tends to blow stronger in the winter months. So in that sense, it is very complementary to solar. So the combination of solar and wind won't completely do it. You're still going to need energy storage. You're still going to need either batteries or converting to hydrogen or water storage or something, but it goes a long way towards evening out the energy generation during the year. So that's important. I really do believe the argument is you can't just have solar, you need to balance that with preferably onshore wind at the same time. So another thing which is important is the development time for projects. This is rather indicative, so take it with a slight pinch of salt, but it shows, I think, just overviewing, you've got domestic PV and rooftop solar there, which can be implemented pretty quickly. And that's one of their very attractive natures. You can put them on very quickly without very much in the way of permissions required. Anything which is industrial takes in the area of years to put on, but onshore wind is pretty good. 2 to 4 years is fairly common for an onshore wind project in Scotland, for example. And that's some of the fastest time that you can bring on renewable energy. Some of the others, offshore wind at the moment is much longer, 5 to 8 and even longer, 10 years in some cases. And as we move into the deep offshore with floating wind, then that is likely to go up as well. And then out there at the end is nuclear, which is a nightmare to get approved, and is another reason why I think it should have a nail in its particular coffin. So I think the other thing to say is that the technology for wind has actually changed a lot. It continues to evolve. A lot of very bright people put a lot of research into wind energy, and this is just not even a particularly modern wind turbine. It's 2 megawatts, the sort of one that you might consider for an area around in Dorset, with a tower that's 80 meters tall and a blade diameter of 90 meters, so a radius of 45. Operates in the sort of wind speeds you'd expect to see in Dorset. And it would take, just as a measure, it would take about 18 such turbines to decarbonize an area such as Dorchester. But what I think is interesting is that the technology itself has changed a lot. So the blade design has moved on, and the current blades are much, much quieter than the earlier ones that we might have had experience of. You'll notice the latest turbines have, like aircraft wings, they have little blades which turn up at the very end, because it's as they cut through the air, which makes a lot of difference in terms of the efficiency and the noise that's generated. So that aircraft technology has been converted to wind turbines and been used very effectively to make them much quieter than they used to be. There's also much less flicker, and that goes along with the size. So modern turbines tend to be larger, and that's because if they're taller, they tend to access the wind speeds, the stronger wind speeds. And there is a relationship with wind speed and power, which is a power of 3. So you double the wind speed, and you get 8 times as much power out of your turbine. So there are big advantages of having taller turbines. So all of us may have experience of turbines in the past, but you really need to go and look at a modern turbine and be astonished by how close you can get to them and still find that they're very, very quiet. This is an example of a wind farm, I guess something which is on the scale that you might consider in Dorset. This happens to be in Leicestershire. These are such turbines as the ones we've just seen, 11 turbines with a capacity of just over 22 megawatts. There are negative sides, of course, and it wouldn't be fair for me just to talk about the positives. And I think one of the strongest negatives comes down to the visual impact. And when you see wind farms being rejected, it very often comes down to people's opinions about the visual impact on the AONB or the area they're in, etc. Because most of the other things can be mitigated, but visual impact is something which is you can't do anything about. And I think what I would just say is that in other countries, you know, they've learned to love and they've learned to live with onshore wind in a way that perhaps we are slightly more skeptical. This is an example from Switzerland, where they've got several turbines sitting right at the top of alpine peaks. You can't get much more visual than that. But to the local communities, they are a sign of modernity and progress, and they're quite happy to accept them within their mountain terrain. The only example I could find from Dorset, there is a wind turbine near Puddletown, and I compare it with Hardy's Monument, which is not the most beautiful of monuments we have, but it is revered by some. And you know, it is really a matter of personal opinion. Some people actually really like the look of wind turbines and think that they are not visually disruptive. Other people absolutely loathe them, and we have to respect both opinions. As regards Dorset, you can look at the wind speed maps, and no need to go into now, but there's plenty of areas which are suitable for wind without having to go onto the coastline where they are particularly visually intrusive. And in the last plan for Dorset, Dorset Council, in fact, the draft local plan, they put together potential sites in Dorset. So this is using ordinary screening criteria, so looking at radar and aircraft, locality, etc., and coming up with possible areas. So that's a long way from getting approved areas. There's a lot more work that have to take place, but it's a very, very first indication of what would be suitable. And I'm just going to take you to one area, or one set of areas here, close to Dorchester, where I am. This is so site 1 is the largest area identified in Dorset. It's about 4 square kilometres, and it's part of it is where the Slyers Lane wind farm was proposed back about 8 years ago, and I know Jean is going to talk about that later on. But it is a potentially viable site that we as a community might want to consider. Just to put it on there because it's topical, that is the so-called North of Dorchester development that again is very controversial. So it doesn't overlap with it, but it gets quite close. I'm not quite sure why that's there. Yeah. Sorry, let me just come out of there. I think I've lost a few slides for some reason. No, okay. I've just got in slightly the wrong order. Sorry for that. Oh, I know what's happened. Yeah, okay. This is what happens when you make too many changes at the last minute. So the other site I was just going to mention, because again, this is a personal thing, I think it's quite an attractive site. It's a site which is in the AONB. It's called Rabsham Down, and it used to be, you see the photograph on the left there, it doesn't look like that now because all but about 3 or 4 of those aerials have been taken down, but it was used as a transmission area for the BBC for many decades. It's a relatively remote part of Dorset. It has an industrial site around it, which was used for the transmission, and it has power source for that. So in many ways, it's actually quite a good site, and it's a windy site, and a wind farm on that location would certainly be capable of decarbonising most of Bridport, for example. So it's the sort of thing, if you want to be serious about decarbonising your local areas, that's the sort of site which perhaps we ought to consider. So a couple of recent developments, and I'm very close to the end of my talk now. In December of last year, the government put out consultation on changes to the planning documents. And in that, many organisations called for the removal of the footnote 54 so that onshore wind would be on the similar footing as any other planning application that we put in. Now, there are some organisations that want that footnote kept in, and there are other organisations that would like to see it removed. We have not yet heard back from the government what their intentions are. In May of this year, there's also a consultation proposal which has been put out by the government on community engagement and benefits, and it focuses on offshore wind, on onshore wind, and developing local partnerships with the potential for discounted energy bills. There's been a very good report by Regen, which if Poppy Maltby comes along, she might want to talk about, but that's been released. It's supporting organisations that may want to respond back to the government consultation. But basically it says that a few things which I think are quite topical. It says that you need to have a more positive planning environment, which means removing that footnote from the NPPF. You need to support energy bill reductions, but they'd like to open it, not just reducing bills, but also shared ownership of schemes and potentially full community-owned onshore wind projects as being the way to go. And I personally would support that. And they've also recommended that they should reintroduce some sort of funding and local support for community energy projects. And it's interesting, there was an interview with Keir Starmer only a couple of days ago. The Labour Party are trying to put some distance between themselves and the current government, but saying very clearly that they would amend the planning regulations and ensure a lifting of the plan, the ban, and work with communities. So should there be a government change next year, which of course is entire speculation, then that may be part of their policy. So just a few conclusions. Onshore wind has a number of distinct advantages, which could really help us to accelerate towards net zero. And I think we need to consider that very clearly. It's refusing to go on to my next bullet point, so excuse me a moment. Public opinion is moving and is changing in favour of renewables, and we'll hear more about this from Ben in the next talk, including onshore wind, and the politics is changing as well, I think, from the low days of 2015. Modern turbines are larger, but they are quieter with very little flicker, and some people do actually like them. And, you know, we have a real opportunity in Dorset here, I think, to move forward, to decarbonise some of our local areas, give people their energy prices, and take a real stake in our own energy future. And that's the possibility of onshore wind. Thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the whole introduction to the area, and I'm sure we'd like to appreciate jazz hands and all that. Thank you, Giles, for covering that much ground enormously. And this is Ben, who's going to go straight in. Thank you, Ben. You can unmute.
Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself. Thank you very much, thanks for the invitation to Dorset, Cam, for me to speak here. Yes, I am at an environmental psychology conference right now, and what I'm about to present to you is a version of a talk that I'm presenting tomorrow for other academics, and I apologise if I haven't quite managed to pitch it on the right level. Obviously, if anything's unclear, then I welcome requests for clarification. So I'm going to talk about attitudes towards wind turbines in the south of England. We've surveyed a number of sites across the south of England, including 2 in Dorset. This is part of my SOOL project, Surveying Opinion on Local Energy. There we go. So I could skip this slide because this is perhaps a very summarized version of exactly what Giles has already talked about. But I think it's very interesting to reflect on how policy changed in 2015 in England in a way that it hasn't done in other countries. And as I travelled to Denmark, where I am now, by train across Europe, it's really interesting to see all those many wind turbines in Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, and of course it's quite different in England. And the interesting question is, why, from a psychological perspective, is that the case? Why did we change our policies so that the installation of wind turbines decreased by 97% in 2015? So there are other reasons for environmental psychologists such as myself to study wind turbines, and one of the particular examples are, there's already, prior to my study, some evidence that they're a good example of what's called pluralistic ignorance. That's a jargon term. So sorry to lay a jargon term on you. Pluralistic ignorance is basically when the average person has quite a distorted perception of what the average person's opinion is. So a recent famous study looking at a nationally representative sample of Americans found, for example, that while 66 to 80% of Americans support major climate mitigation policies, the same sample, they estimate that prevalence of support for that is about half of what it actually is. So most people are fairly progressive in the sense that they support more radical climate policies than are usually in place in most countries, but most people think they're in the minority in doing so, even though they're actually usually in the majority. And there's one poll that I know of. It was commissioned by a pressure group, but operated by a respectable pollster, Comres, who found that 73% of people supported onshore winds, but only 11% of people thought that support was that high. It's important to distinguish between generally supporting onshore winds and being in favour of an onshore wind farm in your local area. And we have data on that as well. And perhaps the most important data is collected by the government itself. The now defunct BEIS government department has been regularly collecting such data. And the most recent data that they collected in last year showed that 12% of people would oppose, would be unhappy about local onshore winds, and 43% would be happy, with the rest being neutral or unsure or not thinking it's possible in their local area, perhaps because they live in the middle of London or Birmingham or something like that. And there's quite a lot of such data. YouGov would be an example of another fairly well-respected polling company that's collected such data, and most such polls tend to show support around about 70%. And I'm going to talk at the end about why it might be that we see this variation. Total opposition is essentially always small, but whether total support is around 40 or around 70, we can discuss that. A really important point about this is that, and of course you can make the criticism that this is not a very good question, because if you're just asking people literally a one-sentence question, would you be happy to have a wind farm near you? That's not necessarily presenting the respondent with a reality of what it would actually mean for there to be a wind farm. Would it be on their local dog walk? How would it look like on the landscape? How many wind turbines would there be? Where exactly would they be? And so for that reason, some people tend to dismiss this kind of data. And that's one of the issues that my project is designed to address. Here's, and I'll explain shortly exactly how the project addresses that issue. There's quite a lot of existing academic data helping us to understand why people might oppose or support wind turbines. And this very recent study that's been mentioned a few times at the conference that I'm at found 5 important factors that determine whether someone might support or oppose a local wind turbine proposal. If they think it will be economically beneficial, that's very important for determining support. If they have a generally positive attitude towards transitioning to renewable energy, that's very important for predicting support. How much people trust the planning process is important, and how much impact, if they believe that there would be a negative impact on the local nature and residents, then of course that predicts opposition. What they think other people think is also important. That's what we mean by social norms in this context. And we're going to see most of those factors crop up again with regards to my study in South England. So what are we actually doing with this study? Well, one of the goals was simply to describe support and opposition in 10 communities in the south of England. And I wanted to address this issue of whether or not we can use these vague questions, which have to be used if you're doing a national poll collecting what we call nationally representative data from a sample that reflects the whole national demographic profiling, so that they have to live all over the place for that to be true. You can't realistically ask people in a survey like that to respond to specific local plans. So that's what we've done here. We've used specific local plans, and we're looking at how answers to a vague question, such as used by YouGov or the government-based departments, how does that relate to responses to a particular local specified plan? We're also looking at what happens when the sample of respondents is very self-selected because they've chosen to participate in a study that most people choose not to participate in. And we're also comparing that to a sample where most people choose to participate because we knock on their doors and ask them to participate, which means that most people do, so that sample is not very self-selected. I see there's a question. Wiltshire is not in it. You'll see in a second which counties we've looked at. I'll come to that. I'm interested in this question of whether or not people are ignorant about other people's opinion, and we're looking a little bit about the demographic profiles. What is it that predicts a support or opposition? I think it's important for me as a social scientist who's attempting to perform as neutral as possible a study to state what my own personal values are, we should interpret the data from any social scientist or any survey in the light of their own personal opinions and values. So I'm going to say I am extremely worried about climate change, as any scientist would be given the available data, but I don't advocate specific solutions. I have been part of advocate groups campaigning against climate change, but as part of those groups, I've been part of a group that does not advocate specific solutions, but rather advocates democratic determination of solutions. That means that I am in favour of onshore wind turbines in communities where there's more majority support, because I believe that democracy is the most important way to address these crises that we face. And I think that the best way to consult is to use representative samples of community members. And exactly what I mean by representative samples and why I think that's better, that's something that will emerge during the rest of this. And the SOOL project, it exists in part to help communities understand the spectrum of opinion within them. This is a slide that I haven't edited at all, and I apologize somewhat for that, but actually I think it's possible to understand. We don't need to go over all the details of this. There have been 2 waves of questionnaire survey, and because the response rate in those was fairly low, 14% and 7% respectively, We then ran a third wave where we did doorstep interviews, because when you knock on someone's door, they're much more likely to respond to your questions. And so obviously we select entirely random households within the community that we're sampling. So then so that gives us, because we get a 69% response rate, 69% of the people that we're able to talk to that we're able to contact choose to give us answers. That means that data is pretty safe, about as safe as it gets, really, in terms of telling us what opinion within that community really is. We only use the detailed local wind turbine plans in the second questionnaire wave and then in the interviews. And the demographic profile, you can see average age, the percentage of people that have university degrees, and percentage of people that report that they voted for the Conservatives. People are a little bit more educated, a little bit older than the general adult population. The voting pattern is about right for the areas that have been surveyed. Remember, you may think, hold on, the Conservatives won the last election, but remember, many people don't vote. This is an example of what our wind turbine recruitment leaflet looked like. So in the communities that we surveyed by leaflets, we put a leaflet like this into every single letterbox in the area, or attempted to. There are things like scary dogs, or locked gates, or human error that mean that some households perhaps don't get a leaflet, but we're confident that about 95% of households get the leaflets. And obviously we don't need to leaflet when we're knocking on doors to ask people to answer questions. The two key questions that we ask are, we've got a vague question that is very similar to the kind of question that would be used by YouGov or someone like that. Imagine that 4 large wind turbines were going to be built about a mile from where you live. They would not be visible from where you live, but would be visible from nearby. They would provide clean and cheap electricity for about 5,000 houses. Would you most likely oppose or support the building of these wind turbines? That's the question that I'll consistently refer to as the vague question. And then we've got the specified question, where a detailed local wind turbine plan is described, and then they are asked whether they would support or oppose. In wave 2, we ask both these questions, and we always ask the vague question first, but we've experimentally dropped the vague question for a random subset to see if answering the vague question before you answer the specified question makes any difference to how you answer the specified question, and the answer is that it doesn't. Here's an example site. This is in Oxfordshire. There's a disused airbase at Upper Hayford, and near to that airbase there had once been proposed a wind turbine project. It successfully went through planning permission, but they imposed restrictions related to a local military radar that meant that it wasn't feasible for it to go ahead, so it didn't go ahead. We took that project, moved it a bit onto the runway rather than nearer to one of the villages there, and asked people what they would think about that. And we used visual mock-ups to show how it would look. So you probably can't see because it's across the internet, but if I was showing you this picture with the leaflet and with the picture in my hand now on your doorstep, you'd probably see that there are some military bunkers there. Okay, and that's one example project. Another example, Greenham Common. The trustees of the Greenham Common Business Park once proposed that they could build wind turbines. They never went ahead and developed that idea, so we did it for them for the purpose of our study. And that's what we've usually done, used existing plans. And another example of that is the Slyers Lane project, which was once proposed for north of Dorchester. That's part of our study as well. We have another site in further north in Dorset, nearer to Sherborne. And that proposal was inspired by the fact that in the Dorset wind resource map that Giles mentioned earlier, the area that we cited a hypothetical wind turbine in was identified as potential place for wind turbines. That's the visual impact for the Greenham Common site. Okay, so this is what we find in our 10 sites across, and I admit it's central southern England, perhaps. We didn't venture into Devon or across to Sussex and Kent, but we've got Gloucestershire, Oxfordshire, Hampshire, Berkshire, Dorset, and I think perhaps one county that I've temporarily forgotten. And what you can see, these pie charts, green shows support, red shows opposition. And so we have fairly substantial majority support in 9 of 10 areas. There was an area in the Chilterns where there was majority opposition. This is using the vague question, not the specified question. We only have data from the specified question at 5 of these sites, but it doesn't matter. You're going to see why shortly. There's a someone asks, why would you say turbines are not visible from the house? That was simply because, remember, that's the vague question, and we have the specified question as well, where people can work out for themselves whether they could see or couldn't see. And I mean, I'm stealing my own punchline here, but we're about to find out that it doesn't make any difference whether you ask the vague question or the specified question. The reason we chose to say that they wouldn't be visible from your house is because that's the reality. For most people, even when wind turbines are built, you know, a mile or 2 away, they still can't be seen from the house, just because that's, you know, that's the geography of it. So that makes the question most accurate for most people. But yes, some people could see wind turbines from their house when they are built. And we have some examples of that. This is just showing a breakdown of support and opposition at 5 sites. And I think it's worth noting that even for those who vote Conservative, this is often made out to be a party political issue. But even amongst those who do vote Conservative, most people would support the local wind turbines. Right. So yes, this is what I've already been anticipating slightly. So we, as well as the vague question, which is the middle one here, and the detailed question, which is the bottom one here, we also ask an even vaguer question, which is, would you support large-scale renewable energy developments in my area? That's a question that's just taken straight. It's the same question as the government uses. A lot of the questions used in our survey are just the same questions as what the government uses. And what we find is that the more specific you get, the more support you get. So when it's a large-scale renewable energy development, then you've got just under 75% of people supporting. When you've said it's wind turbines, but you haven't given much detail, then you get just over 75%. And then when you give all the detail, support creeps up a little bit further. Whereas opposition stays roughly the same. We can't find a statistically significant difference. And so on the basis of that, I say that we don't have any evidence of what you might call wind turbine specific NIMBYism. Those who oppose wind turbines in their local area, they would tend to oppose any large scale renewable energy developments in their area. So this was my attempt to, this is what I spent most time on when I converted this from a slide for scientists to a slide hopefully making sense for the lay public. So what we do is a kind of what's called a statistical regression model, where we find out what factors about an individual help us predict whether that individual would tend to support or oppose wind turbines. And so these are various factors that might or might not apply to an individual, or might apply or to a greater or lesser extent, such as education or being old. When it's blue, that means it predicts support. When it's orange, it predicts opposition. And black, there's just no statistical connection. And the bigger the text, the more stronger the relationship was. So being conservative voter does mean you're slightly less supportive of local wind turbines, but that's quite a weak effect. This was the only surprise, and it's quite a big surprise. Being more educated meant that you were more likely to be opposed. Now that's coming from a statistical model where we include all these variables together. So if you won't all understand this jargon, and I apologize for it, but basically what we're doing is we're controlling for all the variables. If you just look at the connection between education and support for climate mitigation, such as wind turbines, if you just look at that association by itself, you would find that the more educated people are more supportive. But if you look at what difference education makes when you're taking into account all these other things, like, for example, concern about climate change, which is also associated with education, it turns out that being educated means you're less supportive. Who knew? I can't really explain that, but it's interesting. Being older, being a man, moderately important, being concerned about climate change, not being frightened. And I think I've probably already used up all my time, so I'm going to have to skate over the difference between that. The most important thing was believing that the UK benefits economically from renewable energy. That's the strongest predictor of supporting wind turbines in our data. A higher response rate is associated with increased neutrality at the expense of both support and opposition. So remember, we got low response rates to the questionnaire. So then we went and knocked on doors to make sure that we could have a sample with very high response rates. And what we find is that neutrality increases at the expense of both support and opposition. That's not a proper experiment. There are other reasons apart from the response rate that might help to explain that. I'm going a little faster now because I haven't been timing myself, but I'm pretty sure I've probably taken more than 20 minutes. My apologies. And this pluralistic ignorance, I forgot to take the jargon out of this slide. That's the thing where you have a bad estimate of what other people think. So just on the right-hand side, that's just a reminder of what other people think. And this is what people think other people think. 51% of opposition. So most people, even though we have strong support, most people think, when you look at the whole population, most people think that a narrow majority are opposed. So, and how do we explain that? There is, in fact, another study, a PhD thesis published in 2018 that explicitly tried to explain why that might be the case. And what they find is that, so they did a kind of discourse analysis of, for example, of local media, the way that local media cover things when there's a proposal for wind turbines. And they find that opposition is actively legitimized in journalistic discourse. The project opponents were more actively engaged in the planning process, and project opponents incorrectly perceive themselves as a numerical majority group. So basically, opponents are louder, more confident because they incorrectly believe that they're in the majority, and that causes everyone basically to go, well, I guess they probably are in the majority. And that's probably, speaking of the title of this meeting, one of the main barriers. One of the main barriers is incorrect perceptions of what people actually think. So I said I would try and explain why we find about 70–80% support, why YouGov, ComRes, other pollsters find 70–80% support, whereas the base data, although all of these find very similar low levels of opposition, there is variation in levels of important variation in levels of support. And I think it could be because I'm not measuring the national population, I'm measuring a rural population, and the stereotypes, as we've discovered now, don't apply. It could be that the rural population is more pragmatic and more supportive. My top guess, and it's just a guess, we'd have to do more work to understand this. I think it's because the questions that I have put and that others have put state how much electricity is generated. And speaking anecdotally, from doing a lot of doorstep interviews, most people are quite surprised by how much electricity is generated by a large wind turbine. And I think that's what probably gets some neutral people off the fence. There are some weaknesses of the study. So I've emphasized that when people are self-selected, it makes it look like there's more opposition than there actually is. And I think that is probably true, but that is based in part on this comparison of my very self-selected questionnaire sample versus my much more randomly selected interview sample, but there are other differences, other obvious differences between those samples, like one is answering anonymously online, the other is speaking to me, and there might indeed be some social desirability bias in interviews. My belief is that, which that means answering in not how you actually think, but how you think your questioner wants to be answered. I think it's not giving the population sufficient credit for knowing their own minds to say that that would be a large effect. And furthermore, as we've seen, it's not clear, as me as a neutral interviewer on the doorstep, it wouldn't be clear to people what I actually think. If you Google me, you might find some information that gives you a clue about that. But people who I've just knocked on their door, they've got no idea who I am, and they think they think more people oppose than support. So yeah, I don't believe that social desirability bias is likely to strongly explain this. There's 69% response rate is still not 100%. I don't have time to talk about it. I've done a kind of sensitivity analysis that tries to take that into account, basically by assuming that there's more opposition amongst those that don't want to talk to us, which, by the way, everyone who says they don't want to talk to us tells us that it's because they don't have time. No one says, I don't like wind turbines, but I don't want to talk to you about that and have you write it down. But so, yeah. Okay, so this is my final slide. I'm sorry if I've gone over time. Most people in the south of England want wind turbines locally. Opposition to local wind turbines, we can't really distinguish that from opposition to any local renewable energy. So there isn't any wind turbine specific NIMBYism. And it's probably not true, this criticism that has been made, that unspecified vague questions, would you like a local wind farm, but we're not going to tell you what it is because we don't know where you live. Those answers to such questions are actually accurately telling us about what people would think about a real local plan. There's strong ignorance about other people's views, and I heard the Keir Starmer interview as well. And one thing that I noted about that interview was that the interviewer kept pressing Keir Starmer, but what are you going to do because local communities don't want them? And a reasonable answer that Keir Starmer could have given at that point was well, actually, that's an incorrect stereotype. Local communities, by and large, do want wind turbines, but he didn't say that, and that's a shame. And I need to publicise my data more clearly, and other similar data, such as the government's own data, should be better known by people such as Keir Starmer. But anyway, self-selection, being part of the roughly 10% of people that actually bother to answer the survey, or indeed the consultation when it's for real, that's probably distorting the discourse. Opponents are more overrepresented in such processes where people strongly self-select. So I would recommend that when there is a real consultation because a developer is proposing something, I would recommend surveying early and getting representative samples and publicizing the results so that people can better understand what other people in their area actually think. And I think this method of you taking doorstep samples is very valuable. And just to remind you that the most important predictor of support was having an accurate grasp of economic benefits, because it is objectively true that the country would economically benefit from more renewable energy because it's cheaper. And yeah, thanks to my collaborators and to the many volunteers that have helped to make this happen. And yes, and we need to wrap it up. So, and that was said to me, I don't know how long ago. So 3 minutes ago. Yes, sorry for taking 3 minutes to wrap it up. I'm done.
But very, very useful stuff and fascinating. There's a lot to go on there, and it ties in with the stall we had at the Bridport Food Festival, where we asked people a sort of straw poll of, are you in favour of local? And surprisingly, well, it wasn't exactly a rigorous survey, but we had 95 people, and almost all of them said, yes, we're quite happy to have solar wind farms in our area. It was really an exercise in in conversation. But it was quite interesting. Nobody came, nobody backed away. So I'm not talking to you a lot because it's quite in favour. So we're not going on to, well, we think we should have them in Rampshire Farm, or should we have them in Slayers Lane? What do you think, Jeannie? So handing over to Jeannie here.
Yeah, I'm here. You have to do the whole thing for me because it's on you're activating it and changing them for me.
I'm with it. There, how's that?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. And I'll say next slide, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Firstly, I think Will Bond was supposed to start talking 4 minutes ago. So I'm actually going to be as brief as I can and do what I can. Basically, this is a long time ago. And it's a very, very local campaign. It's not a lot of social media, and that's next slide. Next slide.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Oh, okay. Okay, fine. Basically, the background was that in 2014, targets the EU agree. There's a target that was agreed that there'd be 20% total energy from renewables by 2020. The UK agreed with the EU that they would deliver 15% because of the low base at which they were starting. And the Dorset Energy Partnership, Bournemouth, Dorset and Poole agreed that they would have 7.5% renewable energy as their target. And that was in the background. The other thing is that the national planning framework at that time, you can read the statement yourself, but basically they were saying that all communities should play their part in renewable energy generation, and that local government should get their act together and help that. Now, the reality at that time was that in 2015, 3.4% of Dorset's energy was from renewables, half of the national output, and less than all the other counties in the south. This is including West Dorset, Bournemouth, and Poole together. Now, the annual, Ben mentioned all the opinion polls, and the government very steadily was having public attitude polls. Every year I was looking at all of them and all the time. Basically, as he said, consistently, though you wouldn't think it, the public was in support of wind energy, and including when it was in their local areas. Okay, it's not drilled down like Ben did, but basically it's not what people believed, but there was support. Developers at that time were encouraged to offer community benefits. It tended to be about £5,000 a megawatt with onshore wind. Excuse me. Right, so Broadview Energy proposed a wind farm at Charminster on Slayers Lane. That's what they proposed, and that was their community benefit. Next slide. So, because the stimulus was that the people that were opposing Slayers Lane were portraying themselves as speaking for the public. And knowing the government added surveys, knowing other things, we thought we would show that other people had a voice as well. So we started West Dorset for a win, and our strategy was to provide accurate information on wind energy, to explain targets to the councillor, what the driver is, but also not to focus at all on the people who were against this project, but to look for the people who were quietly supportive, who were undecided, to focus almost entirely on them. We made it easy for the public to make their views known by basically having stalls, having a lot of stalls, but we had a thing where you could sign a regular statement. You could assign a regular statement, but there was a big, I'm going to say this because big square where you could write what you wanted to say yourself to the councillors is to go into planning. People would say, oh, I couldn't, I have nothing to say. Then they would say something and say, write that down, that was brilliant. And they go, oh, and they would write it in. Well, at the end of the day, we had, I think, 1,100, but it might have been 1,000 letters that went in about 2 months. this is how we did it. Street stalls, website. Okay. The letter writing, I was saying, is very important, is that people did not have the confidence to get online or to write their letter themselves. But given a little bit and given a boost face to face, people who did support Sires Lane would write. Okay, that's it. So it was an election. We wrote to all the candidates, went to the hustings, and we had letters to all the elected councillors. Next. The photographs are from one day, really, or, few days in the same place, but we did have them in other villages. And you can see that people just stopped. I'll just say one quick thing. What we often had, especially at the beginning when we just started, is people would start to walk by, see the turbine and frown at us fiercely. They would slow down. And just as they went by, they'd come back and say, are you for wind turbines? Are you for Sires Lane? And we say, yes. And their shoulders would go down and go, oh, well then, what can I do? And that's not just one individual, it's the people who perceive that everybody was against it except them. Next. We had good coverage in the papers. Next. And the radio. We had a trip to Sires Lane. The developers paid for a trip to Delabole and in Cornwall, and we just promoted it. We did a visit to the Bear Regis one, talked to the guy who put it up, and we promoted the developers' talks and evenings. We kept ourselves away from the developers in that we promoted their things, but we did not stand side by side with them. We did, this is fun, and if there's nothing else, we could almost stop after this. The farmer put a big notebook in a box and it stayed there a year. I think it'd be destroyed these days. And people wrote comments and there were 200 comments. It stayed there the whole year. And, but it was just fun because of the things people said. Next. The outcome was that it might have been 1,000. I can't quite remember, but it was around that. In 2 months, it was turned down. I was not surprised when we started it. I didn't expect to get it through, but we wanted a voice. 3 for, 6 against. I just wanted to go back again. Yeah. The planner's recommendation was on the visual landscape, and Natural England has said that landscape is a lot more things than that. That it's the historic settlements, it's the agriculture, it's the wildlife, it's the water courses. That is landscape as well. Okay, the irony, of course, is that just down the hill, we have this proposal for all these houses. Okay, we are going to be very visual. Okay, change, what's different now? People, the climate emergency, the cost of living, erosion of public services, the weakening of a public forum. You saw all those people gathered around us, face to face, big discussions. I don't know after COVID whether we would get that without getting a lot of aggro. And I think that the visual landscape traditional view, that is what landscape is, not its whole thing of what it is, still seems to hold sway in some parts of the population. Okay. Oh, that's to make you cheer up. One of the main emphases of our campaign was not to be anti or anti the antis, but to be positive. And we had a very positive outlook.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeannie. That was fantastic. And you got in a huge amount of stuff in there. Talking very quickly, but actually, absolutely, you get the on the ball. How you do it, how you work at it. Keep positive. Don't worry about the unpleasantness. And there was a lot of unpleasantness, but you managed to get past that. Thank you for that. So we're moving on to Will, and I've got to do a bit of sharing again. Are you there, Will?
I'm here. Don't worry about the slide to start off with. That comes part way through the talk.
Okay.
So shall I just kick off?
Yeah.
Sort of start just by being on screen. When I started preparing my talk, having been asked to do the history and an update, I realized that the slow, frustrating journey of the history makes a slow, frustrating talk, and it would be pretty depressing and then easily end up as kind of catalogue of complaints. So if that's what you tuned in to hear, I apologise, because instead I'm going to use that experience to run through the process to get Dorset's next commercial scale wind farm up and running. That is not a specific, I should say, at this stage. But as a concession to the subject I was given by Sam, I will start with a quick update on the Alaska wind farm. The whole saga started 20 years ago, but let's pick up from 2021. By that stage, we had all the consents and energy prices had risen a bit, but there was no obvious reason for them to rise further in the foreseeable future. So myself and my partners figured it wasn't really financially viable at that stage to build with new turbines because the costs are monumentally high. But being Dutch and more in contact with the rest of Europe, they were aware that wind farms on the continent were being upgraded as part of the drive to increase renewable energy capacity over there. They were taking down quite big turbines to put up even bigger ones. So 5 to 7 year old turbines have been taken down at only a quarter of the way through their design life. The cost to us, of course, has been much lower than the new turbines. Nevertheless, there's quite a lot of disadvantages as well. So there's quite a lot of hard thinking and sucking of the teeth, but we decided in the end to go ahead and use second-hand turbines. The disadvantages are they're so unusual over here, it's almost impossible to raise finance. Bankers and funders want to lend money on new machinery, not second-hand machinery. And that, as with anything you buy second-hand, you can only choose from what's available on the market at the time. So what we actually bought is slightly less capacity than what we have permission for. It's a shame, but at least it did mean we could get the show back on the road.
Will, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but just, are you aware you're showing us your email inbox?
No, I shouldn't be showing you my email inbox. That's very interesting. How's that happening?
This is my inbox, I think.
Oh,
It's
someone's email inbox anyway.
It's the email that he sent me because of the pictures didn't work. So this will follow the pictures are following here.
Good. Nothing too embarrassing on my inbox then that's kind of coming out. No, so Ben, thank you, but there aren't any valid slides quite yet. We're just coming to the first one, because what I was going to say is the advantages, obviously, of using second-hand turbines are cost, and now we get to the first slide. Thank you, Sam, of reusing an asset on a very large scale. Does that move up a bit, Sam? Because on my screen, it's...
Can you see that? Has it got the reduce, reuse, recycle?
Oh, I've only got half of it.
No.
I don't know what other people can see.
Let's try and make it smaller by... Is that going to make it smaller? No, it's not going to make it smaller. Well, here we go. Again, reduce it a bit. No, it's not going to do that.
Never mind. You all know what that looks like. Basically, we're reusing a huge asset, which has great appeal. Once you get used to the idea, oh, should we use a second-hand turbine, or I don't know, would it work or not? And then you think, actually, we're recycling this massive load of steel and electrics and all the rest of it. It seems rather appealing. The other advantage of second-hand machines is actually they're proven in duty. Because we all know new machinery is not always terribly reliable. So while they're on the ground, we can get them serviced as well and get the blades polished to get as new performance. So in November and December 2021, which is now a long time ago, the tower sections of our second-hand turbines were delivered to the site. Any chance of another slide, Sam?
How's that looking?
completely unchanged on my screen from
It's
before.
still the email inbox.
Sam, I think you're not. You need to share the
Right,
your
let's go.
screen sharing your inbox rather than the actual pictures.
Right, sorry about that. Let's try again. Right, so sorry.
I should apologise. This is largely my fault, but it's been a slightly interesting evening, and I had to dump everything on Sam to get organised.
So is that no? No, is it still inbox? Oh bother.
I'll keep going.
So I
anyway.
believe you're doing that thing where you're only sharing a specific window rather than just what's on your screen.
Yes. Stop sharing. Start sharing again. Really isn't. I see what you're saying.
Hey,
Yes.
yep. Just scroll down slowly. So tower sections are being delivered to the site. That's a short fat section reversing back over the Puddletown Road after turning into the site entrance. If you scroll down a bit, Sam, we get a long thin section. That's one of the top sections, and they are long. So there's actually 4 sections to each turbine. Let's scroll down one more, Sam. So we now have a very fine collection of tower sections waiting for the nacelles and the blades, the nacelles being kind of gearbox bit, and the blades, which are actually still in the workshop. Whoa, don't get carried away yet. The nacelles and blades were in the workshop in the Netherlands, and the contract to build the foundations and the cabling, this is back in December 2021, were nearly ready to be signed. But then Putin did what we didn't expect. Not only did prices for everything rocket, but you actually couldn't buy the steel for the reinforcing for the foundations. You couldn't buy the heavy cables for the electricity. Concrete was literally rationed because of the cement shortages, as was the fuel to run the machinery. And since Brexit, Labour had already been in short supply, so unavoidably, the project went back on hold again. Since then, our costs have increased by over £1 million, which creates funding and cash flow problems, but we are moving again now. So on down one more, Sam. This is a picture I took about 4 hours ago of one of the foundation rings, one of the turbines being unloaded, just come across from the Netherlands today and yesterday. And we should be ready for the big crane to do the full assembly in early autumn. And there's then still quite a lot of work to do. We should be putting electricity into the grid in very early 2024. If we're really, really lucky, I'll get a good Christmas and can get some power into the grid in the very final stages of 2023. The connection for the wind farm to the grid at Wareham is also underway. This is a picture I took first thing this morning. Oh, well, it wasn't first thing, today being the longest day, but it felt like first thing this morning. It was about 6:30, I think. So this is ploughing the ducting in so that the cables can be run through it to the substation. So it's been another busy day on this project, and things are really, really happening now. And unless we get another Ukrainian type surprise, we really are heading towards completion now, I believe. And that really is the Alaska wind farm update. So what I wanted to do was just extend that, think, well, if we're going to build another wind farm in Dorset, which is presumably what a majority of people here would like to do, what are the obstacles that I would identify based on my experience? And in the short term, they are not the public. Let me take you through the process of how a commercial wind farm of, let's say, 4 to 8 turbines gets built. To start off with, you've got to find a suitable site likely to have adequate wind speeds and a willing landowner, of course. Let's say we've done that. And no, it isn't that easy and isn't that quick, but let's just assume it for now. Before we do anything else, we've got to check whether we can get a connection to the grid to export all that lovely energy we're going to harvest. If we're in Dorset, the answer is almost certainly no, we can't get a connection, at least not for about a decade. The grid whether it's the national grid at 132,000 volts or the regional grid at 33,000 volts, is pretty much stuffed. If we built our wind farm in the centre of Bournemouth, where there's lots of wires that have to cope with lots of download, then some spare capacity to upload as well. But you don't build wind farms in town centres, and you can probably work out why not. If anybody needs to talk about it, we can come back to that. So for the next 5 years at least, I expect no big renewables applications in Dorset. Any that do come in are tied to a very specific substation and a very specific set of circumstances. So how long will it take the grid to decarbonise generation? Well, personally, I think it's going to be 10 years plus. And the reasons why would fill another whole webinar, perhaps for another time. But let's say our little group is determined. We're going to apply for a connection anyway. And let's assume we get offered a connection date of 2030 for our wind farm. So only 7 years away. We need, first of all, next, having got our grid connection, to do a proper energy yield assessment, which done properly takes a couple of years. Because though 1 year will give you a good indication of what the wind yield is likely to be, if you're going to borrow in excess of £10 million, let's say, for this project, the people who are funding it say, how good is the evidence that you can pay back this loan? And they want, ideally, at least a couple of years of data. So you get started on that as well. And once we're confident we've got enough energy yield to justify going further, we need to conduct the ecological surveys to show the site isn't already occupied by protected species. It's not on a migration flight path for bats or birds. There's not a general wildlife issue. And from this autumn, you've also got to allow for biodiversity net gain, which simply complicates life even more. It's a good idea, but it does complicate it. So that goes on building up. That's another £250,000 to £1 million, probably on a lot of sites, sometimes a bit cheaper, and it's going to take 18 months to 3 years to complete. Sorry, Giles, I'm disagreeing with you on this bit, but depending on seasonality. And the time required isn't just for the surveys themselves, it's also to write the detailed reports to go in with the planning application. And this all has to happen before planning, so it's all funding at risk. If we're brave, we can start the landscape and visual assessment at the same time. I say we're brave because if the ecological assessment turns up a showstopper, then that's a complete waste of money, as would be all the other things like the archaeology, the protected airspace, the transport, and all the surveys that need to be done to get up with a valid planning application. And that's why it's only the developers who usually gets this far. They've spent £1 million before even talking to a planner. And that just gets you enough information to make a planning application. The planning application itself is complicated because somebody's got to pull together all these studies into a coherent argument that may well face legal challenges. So it has to be thorough, it has to be watertight when it's challenged in court. So that's all going to take, in our case, over a year, getting it ready for submission. Then when the planning authority receives it, they want to check everything is correct and validated. That takes a couple of months. Then it goes to the planning officer. Then they consult all the interested parties, which includes the parish councillors, the neighbours, the statutory authorities, the NGOs, the busybodies and the NIMBYs, and gives them something like 4 months to respond before getting into a cycle of extensions, questions, further extensions, and so on. I would hope that nowadays, with more people aware of climate change, it could be turned around in a year, but I wouldn't bet on it. And following that, assuming consent is given and assuming no legal challenges, there'll be a few planning conditions to discharge, so another few months. And then with the planning consent, you can actually start negotiating serious money funding. Once you got that, then you can talk to the turbine suppliers about putting a deposit down on your turbines. Lead times on turbines at the moment, about 3 years for a reasonable one. Once you know that, then you can start constructing the bases and the electrical works and so on. So working backwards, if we think we might get a grid connection for 2030, when do we need to start work? The answer is we should have started, not surprisingly. Really, it is a slow, risky process. Now, having gone through all that, I haven't even mentioned public attitudes. I haven't identified that we need public support. Why not? Surely it matters. Well, it does matter. Because in this whole process that I set out, there are a number of gateways, you might call them, for the project has to get through to progress. Can a suitable site be found? Is the wind speed sufficient? These are technical or factual issues. So are ecology, archaeology, and even funding to a degree. But as we all know, planning consent is a critical gateway. And despite all the planning laws and guidance, the decision of the planning committee will be subjective. And that's what makes it the biggest, most unpredictable risk in the whole project. A planning authority with a reputation for making irrational decisions is a real turn-off for wind farm developers. Why risk £1 million of pre-planning surveys and reports in Dorset if the planning decision is random? They'd be better off to invest elsewhere. And that's why influencing public opinion matters. Because if developers believe they'll get a good hearing here, they're incentivized to invest in Dorset or in Dorset's next wind farm. If they think the odds are better elsewhere, they'll take their money elsewhere. And that's why, even though I didn't mention it earlier on, getting public support is absolutely critical to the development of Dorset's next wind farm to come online as soon as possible after 2030, I would suggest. And just finally, there is one other critical role supporters play, which is personal. Back when we first went to planning in 2009, or it might have been 2013, a standard tactic used by the anti-wind lobby, CPRE and others, was to try to force the landowner to pull out of the wind farm deal, which is logical. I can understand why they did it. But they used to apply pressure in any way possible. So my wife, who's a teacher, used to get hate mail from children, allegedly children. I'm not convinced myself that it really was children, but that sort of stuff. And a lot of it was really gutter stuff. And it was bad enough. There was another landowner on another wind farm, I think in the Midlands, who was actually driven to suicide, literally by the pressure, because he'd signed a deal and he couldn't get out of it. And there was a second one who was rumoured to have been a similar sort of thing. And actually having a supporter group like Pete, as it was then, Purbeck Environmental Action Team, who were supporting me and giving me the other side of the equation, saying, look, we do support you. It was a major factor in stopping that pressure from getting out of control for me personally. And I really want to thank everybody who, at that stage and any future stage, supports the people who are being put under undue pressure, whichever side of the coin they're on, because that was really dirty. That is my very quick summary. I hope we've recovered a little bit of time. Thank you for listening.
Well, it's absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that, Will. I think there's no doubt that in the future, you'll be seen as a good ancestor. I hope you've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren who can look back at you and say, this is my grand, he did that, you know, because, you know, what you've been through is just extraordinary. Now, we've got to 9:03. Supposing we carried on for 10 minutes chat and then we broke for 5 minutes and then come back for another 20 minutes if you feel like it. Does that sound good? Or do we want to, are we getting hungry? Beryl, you got a question or a comment? You're muted still.
Yeah, sorry, I've just, to back what Will's saying, I was part of Pete, so really did back him for everything we'd got, you know. I was the only, excuse me, I was the only county councillor at that time that actually stood up against everyone else and said, we need this. And it went to public inquiry. I mean, you know, he hasn't said that, but there was a big fight and we really did have to go for it. against all the odds, and it was absolutely marvelous when he got it. I mean, I said the same when the Navitus Bay was. I was the only county councillor that stood up and said, we need this. And afterwards, the chief planning officer said to me, you're right, Beryl, you're absolutely right. We should be backing this. And really it was all the, NIMBYs and saying, oh, it's going to ruin tourism in, Swanage Bay and Bournemouth and everywhere else. And actually, that's rubbish when you think of all the offshore. I've just been up in Kent in the Camber Sands. I mean, people pour down at Rye and Camber Sands and everywhere and don't take any notice of the wind farm at all, only that they're using it, of course. But I mean, it's just this concept, and in all the the talks we've had this evening, it's this perception of people, and certainly that I've learnt something new from Ben today. And I've got to say, Ben, are you the son of Bridget? Are you any related?
Yes, I am the son of Bridget and Robert. Yes.
I thought your accent sounded almost Purbeck, and I know they've got relations in Denmark, so I thought, you've got to be. Well done. And I'm a real great friend of Bridget, and my son actually worked for them at Biotrack in the old days. But I think that actually what's so wonderful about all of this now is that people have turned the corner, and we have got the support. And although we haven't got Pete going, still we've got Planet Purbeck, and we've got Youth Planet Purbeck with the youth centre now, and certainly with all Sustainable Wareham, Sustainable Swanage, and all the other things that are going on in Purbeck. If the planning application came in now, I'm sure this would have turned the corner, and we'd have 70% for. And I think the perception is, we've got to do this. We've got to save the planet.
Thank you. Thank you, Beryl.
Well done.
I'm going to take another question from the hands up, and then Tracy, maybe you've got some from the chat. So Bob, would you like to, you had a question there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I enjoyed very much all these presentations. Giles, I hope you'll be able to share your slides afterwards. That was very helpful. It seems to me that the point that was raised right at the end about the current problem of gaining connections to the grid is a significant one. And so we should prioritize those sites where it is potentially easiest. And I wondered if can't remember what the site is that's near Bridport, but presumably that would be relatively straightforward to connect. But I don't know enough about its history as to whether it could be resurrected, the plan for a site there. So Giles, could you remind me what the name of that site is?
It's called Rabrisham Down. I mean, the extra issue there is that it's in the AONB, so there's all the national park policy, etc. But it's not impossible.
There's a lot of fuss putting a solar farm there, and I think they decided to go for the solar farm because the wind turbines would be even harder.
Yeah, but there used to be those big towers there. I mean, were the towers taken down because it was an AONB, or I mean,
they no longer were needed. They were part of, wasn't it, BBC?
Right.
In fact, the RAF asked that 3 of them remain because it acts as a waypost for them to tell where they're going.
So Tracy, do you have any questions from the chat that you wanted to highlight? Are you there, Tracy? Okay, well, so Henry, you got a question or a contribution?
It's a contribution. Where I applied for some turbines on Rabrisham Down a little bit further west than the site that Giles is talking about, way back in the 90s, and it was turned down for reasons of skyline clutter. Of course, I don't know whether that's changed now, given the view of Poundbury from Chartminster. but also it was objected to by the, where is it now, the Yeovilton objected to it because it would interfere with the use of the routes they use for their aeroplanes.
Will.
Yeah, just Beryl said might get a higher level of support. I could remind Beryl that at the first planning meeting on the Alaska wind farm, the planning officer was slightly reluctant, I think, to announce that of the 705 letters to the planning authority, 75% were in support and only 25% were against, which I think came as a surprise to everybody for all the reasons we've been talking about. But that was a decade ago.
If I could say as well, that was exactly the same sort of proportion of responses that I received to my application.
Right, Tracy.
Right, sorry, I apologise. I was just trying to say I've had to do this on my phone because I was on another meeting that was still running and I was recording. So I do apologise. Bear with me and I'll go through them. I think, forgive me, I don't remember your name because I joined late. I think the first couple of questions were, Ben, were answered by you already as we went along. But you have had a couple in since, so I think you answered onshore wind energy does not currently provide cheaper electricity homes. It is not reflected in bills, so why make the claim that why make the claim in the vague case? Did you answer that one, Ben?
Yeah, so I think that there might be a couple of issues here that might be getting conflated. So onshore wind, I mean, as far as I know, it's the cheapest form of renewable energy around right now. But absolutely, there's a valid issue. Cheaper for who? Are those benefits passed on to local residents? And Bob quite reasonably asked the question about when the question was put to my respondents whether they would support the vaguely described project. It was described as providing cheap, clean energy, and it didn't say who that was for, who is saving money. And of course, it can sometimes be local residents, and there are wind developers that are trying that now in this country. Google the Octopus Fan Club if you're interested in that, and that's a model that's very well established on the continent, but not as much in this country, to my knowledge. Addressing very specifically the question of of the validity of the question that I used on that basis, I'd have to just point out again that when we did specify that's the vague question that just has like 3 or 4 sentences and doesn't go into detail. The specified projects, it was not stated that that there would be cheap electricity for anyone. It just stated how much electricity would be produced, and the responses, as I said, were basically the same. People weren't responding differently to that question. I do have some data. The same respondents have answered questions about how their opinions might be different if there was cheaper electricity for them, whether that might make them more positively disposed to the project, or whether it might not make a difference. And I'm afraid I just simply haven't analysed that data yet. But anyone who wants to look at my data is welcome to do so. We have something called pre-registration, basically modern good practice with data analysis is to, because there's more than one way to skin a cat when it comes to data analysis, and if you do it a slightly different way, you might get a slightly different answer. I can't do the data analysis until I've done the pre-registration, and it takes time. So I haven't been able to analyze all of my own data yet, but it's in the public domain. Anyone who wants can look through my data. I know some of you here tonight have been doing that, and you know, you're welcome to.
Well, I think we could carry on like this for really quite a long time, but I'm suggesting that I now close the meeting officially.
Oh, there are a couple more questions, actually. Sorry to say.
All right.
Do you want me to just go through them quickly?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So there's also a comment asking Giles to contact Bill at Wiltshire Climate Alliance with your number. Ben said he's happy to share the slides for everyone who wants to, then they can be downloaded, and he's put the link in there. And I think there was just a couple of very positive comments to Ben here, saying basically agreed that the vague question does not explicitly state what we've kind of talked about already. So but he's just saying, I will follow up and find out more about some of your research at Grantham Research Institute at the LSE. And full detail about the projects is available at brooks.ac.uk, so sul.brooks.ac.uk, and that's the raw data we were talking about. And that's pretty much it. So there isn't actually questions, it's just kind of like an ongoing conversation, really. So thank you, everybody, and I'll shut up, okay? And put my hand down. I just was it still up.
I'll send an email with those links and the link to the video. And Giles, are you willing to share your presentation?
Yes,
no problem. We will find a way of either sending it around or putting a link to that. And
on the website.
We'll send that around, and it leaves me to thank all the 4 speakers for a really quite extraordinary meeting, and you know, you've given us a lot to think about, and you know, thank you very much. I'm impressed by all 4 of them.